October 15, 1929, 2 weeks before the 1929 crash, when the famous Professor Irving Fisher of Yale, in a speech before the Purchasing Agents Association of New York, said that the US stock market had reached a permanently high plateau. The newspapers picked up that new, colorful phrase over the next couple of days. That spectacularly ill-timed and ironic phrase became an epidemic, probably affecting the duration of the market debacle, and it is still widely remembered today. In fact, those three words are more famous today than the title of any of the books that Fisher spent years writing. They are in the same league with other colorful phrases such as irrational exuberance and la faire courbe. These words and their effects came from outside the economy, and they are therefore exogenous. Also, anniversaries of past events can resurrect economic narratives, even though a narrative of years past, such as the 1987 stock market crash, has lost its contagion. It may still exist in the dim recess of memory for older people at least, but it has the potential to become contagious again if it is tweaked and probably renamed and reattached to human interest story. For example, the news media tend to remind the public about the 1987 crash on major anniversaries, and they will predictably continue to do so until there is a bigger one-day crash. At that point, 1987 will no longer be the record holder, at which time it won't be of any interest at all. By 2013, the Bitcoin narrative was beginning to fade. It was an old story, and the price of Bitcoin dropped from over US $1,000 at its 2013 peak to just over $200. But proliferation of new inventions or mutations kept the idea alive. Notable among these inventions was the initial coin offering, ICO, which allowed new cryptocurrencies to be developed with distinctively different stories. These currencies were backed, in effect, as shares of corporations. The ICO brought a flood of new narratives, each tied to a particular coin identified with some line of business. It brought back into public esteem the old sport of picking stocks, which had become somewhat tarnished as a fool's errand. There was something new to talk about. In 2017 alone, there were over 900 initial coin offerings. for crowd-funded business startups that wanted to raise money for some new venture. Almost half of them failed within a year, but new ICOs kept coming. Of course, economists are aware of the narratives associated with events, but mostly they work on the assumption that the narratives are nothing more than a bit of silliness that follows the discovery of changing real news about deep economic forces. The presumption is often that these deep economic forces are caused exclusively by scientific advances in production, discovery, or unexpected exhaustion of natural resources, demographic changes, or economic research that provides new information on how government policymakers can adopt better rules of action. But this mode of thinking misses what may be the essential elements that cause change in the economy. As we saw in part 1, the economic narratives surrounding these events work in predictable ways. They are contagious, they suggest scripts for people to follow, they repeat their messages, and they thrive on human interest. In doing so, they affect society and the course of economy activity in highly consequential ways. Controlled experiments from outside economics show direction of causality. While we may sometimes be able to infer direction of causality by studying economic history, we need also to recognize that controlled experiments outside of economics have shown narratives effects on human behavior. In the field of marketing, Jennifer Edson Escalas notes, self-referencing occurs when the viewer of an advertisement relates a product to his or her personal experiences. But not all self-referencing is equally effective in changing buyer behavior. Using controlled experiments, Escalas has compared analytical self-referencing, an explanation of why you need the product, to narrative self-referencing and narrative transportation, which present a story that causes an individual to imagine himself or herself to be another person using the word I rather than you. Escalas found that the narrative transportation is more effective, especially when the analytical case for the product is weak. In journalism, Marcel Machil and his co-authors, noting evidence that viewers of television news retain little of the news they hear, presented an actual TV news report on the dangers of air pollution to control group. They also presented a variation of the report to the experimental group in the form of a story without protagonist. A baker with health problems caused by air pollution in an unfair struggle against antagonists who benefited from the polluting activities. the experimental presentation of the news was retained better. In education, Scott W. McQuiggan and his co-authors have found motivational benefits of narrative-centered learning. Each 8th grade student in the experimental group played a virtual reality computer game in the role of young Alex, whose father in the fictitious story is the head of team of research scientists on Crystal Island. A mysterious grave disease has afflicted some of the scientists, including Alex's father. Alex is determined to find out why. Playing involves interacting in dialogues with other simulated people. In the process, the student learns about microbiology, about bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. The study documents an advantage in learning relative to the control group with regard to self-efficiency, presence, interest, and perception of control. In health interventions, Michael de Slater and his co-authors studied how to persuade people to eat more fruits and vegetables. They concluded from experiments that didactic presentations of evidence on nutrition were not effective. Audience response was stronger to narrative messages when the audience identified with persons portrayed in the message. In health interventions, these results underscore the need for carefully pre-testing the story and choosing the right persons to convey the message. In philanthropy, Kate Weber and his co-authors, 2006, asked subjects to read a message involving organ donation before asking them to sign an organ donor card. The content of the message, narrative versus statistics, was manipulated. Results indicated that narrative messages were more effective than statistical messages. In law, Brad E. Bell and Elizabeth F. Loftus, 1985, conducted a controlled experiment in which subjects took on the role of jury members. The goal was to determine the jury members' response to vivid prosecutions and non-vivid prosecutions. For example, the vivid prosecution included the irrelevant line that the accused at the time of the crime accidentally knocked over a bowl of guacamole dip onto the white shag carpet. That irrelevant but vivid mental image helped obtain conviction from the experimental jury. In sum, economics can learn from other social sciences, including psychology, especially social psychology. Sociology anthropology, especially cultural or historical anthropology, and history, especially cultural and intellectual history of, or histoire de mentalité, because controlled experiments about whole economies are not readily available to economists. It is all the more important that we specify and understand the building blocks of economic narratives. Stories are one key building block.